In February 1943, Tunisia had become the final contested ground of the North African campaign, a narrow bridge between Allied ambition and Axis resistance, where newly arrived American formations were encountering the Wehrmacht not as a retreating enemy, but as a coherent, experienced force fighting for operational maneuver space. The U.S. Second Corps, recently committed to combat, held a wide and uneven front stretching from the eastern dorsal mountains toward the interior plains, its positions shaped more by map geometry than by terrain logic, with key passes thinly defended and reserves dispersed across long distances. The Kasserine Pass, a narrow defile between rugged ridgelines, was held by elements of the U.S. 1st Armored Division and attached infantry units, formations trained rapidly in the United States and the United Kingdom, equipped with modern but unfamiliar equipment, and commanded within a system that emphasized separation of arms and rigid chains of control. American units in the pass were deployed in isolated strongpoints rather than a continuous defense. Tanks positioned piecemeal, artillery batteries scattered and often lacking direct observation or coordination, infantry insufficiently dug in, and communications dependent on vulnerable radio links that frequently failed under pressure. Command posts were established far to the rear, removed from the battlefield, with orders transmitted slowly and often based on incomplete or outdated information. The enemy they faced was not an improvised force, but battle-hardened German formations drawn from the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, led by officers accustomed to mobile warfare, combined arms coordination, and rapid exploitation of weakness. On 19 February 1943, German armored spearheads struck through the pass with concentrated force, using tanks, self-propelled artillery, and infantry in close coordination, supported by flexible command and rapid decision-making at the forward level. American anti-tank defenses proved insufficient against massed attacks. Tank units were defeated in detail, and attempts at counterattack dissolved amid confusion and conflicting orders. Within days, U.S. forces were pushed back more than 50 miles, abandoning equipment, losing cohesion, and suffering approximately 6,500 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured, along with the destruction or capture of over 180 tanks and hundreds of vehicles. The defeat at Kasserine was not merely tactical, but psychological, shattering assumptions held by Allied planners about readiness, training, and the automatic superiority of materiel. And as exhausted units withdrew into new positions, it became clear that the pass had exposed something deeper than a single failure, a structural weakness that demanded immediate reckoning.
In the days following the retreat from Kasserine, the battlefield itself provided a blunt and unambiguous diagnosis. Scattered wrecks of American tanks burned where they had advanced without infantry support, abandoned artillery pieces silent for lack of coordination, and command posts filled with reports that contradicted one another in timing, scale, and intent. The defeat could not be explained by surprise alone, nor by numerical inferiority, because neither condition had truly existed. Instead, the collapse revealed a system unprepared for modern integrated warfare against an opponent who had already mastered its mechanics. At the core of the failure lay the American command structure, which remained rigid and compartmentalized, with infantry, armor, and artillery treated as semi-independent instruments rather than as parts of a single operational organism. Tank units were committed without synchronized artillery preparation. Infantry was expected to hold ground without adequate mobile fire support, and air power, though present in theater, operated under separate command channels that made timely coordination almost impossible. Orders moved downward slowly, while information from the front moved upward even more poorly, distorted by distance, In the days following the retreat from Kasserine, the battlefield itself provided a blunt and unambiguous diagnosis. Scattered wrecks of American tanks burned where they had advanced without infantry support, abandoned artillery pieces silent for lack of coordination, and command posts filled with reports that contradicted one another in timing, scale, and intent. The defeat could not be explained by surprise alone, nor by numerical inferiority, because neither condition had truly existed. Instead, the collapse revealed a system unprepared for modern integrated warfare against an opponent who had already mastered its mechanics. At the core of the failure lay the American command structure, which remained rigid and compartmentalized, with infantry, armor, and artillery treated as semi-independent instruments rather than as parts of a single operational organism. Tank units were committed without synchronized artillery preparation. Infantry was expected to hold ground without adequate mobile fire support, and air power, though present in theater, operated under separate command channels that made timely coordination almost impossible. Orders moved downward slowly, while information from the front moved upward even more poorly, distorted by distance, broken communications, and a culture that discouraged initiative below senior levels. Doctrinal assumptions further compounded these problems, particularly the belief that tanks should be employed cautiously and often dispersed to support infantry, rather than concentrated for decisive action or defense in depth. American armored units, equipped largely with M3 Lee and early M4 Sherman tanks, were not technically inferior, but they were committed in small packets that allowed German forces to defeat them sequentially. Artillery, potentially the most effective American arm, was underutilized due to decentralized control, limited forward observation, and an absence of standardized fire planning capable of massing effects rapidly. Communications failures played a decisive role, as radio nets became overloaded or collapsed under pressure, leaving subordinate commanders isolated and unsure whether to hold, withdraw, or counterattack. Staff work at division and corps level proved inadequate for a fast-moving battle, with planning cycles too slow to respond to German maneuver, and reserves positioned too far back to influence the fight in time. The result was fragmentation, not of courage or discipline at the soldier level, but of effort, as units fought bravely yet separately, without a unifying operational logic. By the end of February 1943, the evidence was unmistakable. The defeat had not been caused by the quality of the men in the ranks, but by the structure, doctrine, and habits that governed how they were used. And until those foundations were confronted and altered, any return to combat would risk repeating the same outcome under a different name.
The defeat at Kasserine forced the Allied High Command to confront a reality that could no longer be deferred, that the existing leadership and methods within the Second Corps were incompatible with the tempo and demands of the campaign in Tunisia. Reports from the front, corroborated by British liaison officers and senior observers, described not only tactical confusion, but a command climate marked by excessive distance from the battlefield, unclear authority, and a reluctance to enforce accountability. At the center of this system stood Major General Lloyd Fredendall, whose headquarters had been established far behind the lines, insulated from direct observation, and whose control relied on complex, centralized orders transmitted over fragile communications. In early March 1943, General Dwight D. Eisenhower approved a decisive change, removing Fredendall from command and appointing Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. to take over the Second Corps, with Major General Omar Bradley as his deputy. The transition was abrupt and deliberate, signaling that the defeat had consequences not only in lost ground, but in professional standing. Patton arrived in Tunisia with a reputation shaped by discipline, speed, and an uncompromising view of command responsibility, and from his first hours in theater, he made it clear that distance from the front would no longer be tolerated. Headquarters were moved forward, command posts became mobile, and senior officers were expected to see terrain, units, and conditions firsthand, rather than through reports alone. Patton enforced strict standards of appearance, movement, and procedure, not as ceremony, but as a means of restoring order and predictability within a shaken force. Officers were held personally responsible for the condition and performance of their units. Staff sections were reorganized to improve planning and information flow, and training was conducted under field conditions, often within range of enemy artillery. The changes extended beyond personality to method. As command authority was clarified, subordinate leaders were encouraged to act within intent rather than await detailed instructions, and coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air elements was treated as a command obligation rather than an aspiration. These first days did not produce immediate victories, nor were they intended to, but they marked a break with the assumptions that had shaped Second Corps at Kasserine. Beneath the outward discipline and urgency lay a deeper effort to rebuild the Corps as a functioning instrument of war, and the next engagement would reveal whether that effort had been sufficient or merely cosmetic.
The reconstitution of Second Corps after Kasserine was not limited to changes of command or discipline, but extended into the fundamentals of how the American Army intended to fight, forcing a rapid revision of doctrine under active campaign conditions. The most consequential transformation occurred in the employment of artillery, an arm that had been present in strength at Kasserine but used without coherence. In early March 1943, artillery control was centralized at corps and division level, replacing the fragmented battery-by-battery employment that had left firepower diluted and reactive. Fire direction centers were standardized, communications procedures simplified, and forward observers integrated directly with maneuver units, allowing artillery to be massed rapidly against identified threats rather than committed piecemeal. This shift altered the balance of engagements almost immediately, as German armored movements that previously advanced against scattered resistance now encountered dense, coordinated fire that disrupted formations before tanks could close. American gunners refined techniques for defensive fires, pre-registered concentrations, and rapid shifts between targets, turning artillery into the primary means of stopping armored attacks rather than relying solely on tank versus tank engagements. The result was not only greater lethality but predictability, enabling commanders to plan defenses based on firepower rather than improvisation. Parallel changes reshaped the use of armored forces and tank destroyer units, which were no longer dispersed in support of infantry outposts, but positioned to engage enemy armor from prepared positions, often in depth. Tank destroyer battalions were integrated into defensive plans as mobile reserves, coordinated with artillery and infantry rather than committed independently. Communications between armor, infantry, and artillery were streamlined, reducing delays that had previously rendered coordination irrelevant once combat began. Staff work underwent similar revision, as planning cycles were shortened, liaison officers embedded across units, and information flows prioritized accuracy over volume. The intent was not perfection but functionality under pressure, ensuring that decisions reflected battlefield reality rather than delayed reports. These changes did not create a new army in theory, but they reshaped an existing one in practice, compressing lessons that other forces had learned over years into a matter of days. And as Second Corps prepared its next defensive position, the question was no longer whether the doctrine had changed, but whether it would hold when tested by an enemy that had already exposed American weakness once before.
By mid-March 1943, the El-Gettar Valley had been selected not by chance but by calculation, a narrow corridor south of Gafsa where terrain, visibility, and fields of fire offered the possibility to apply every lesson extracted from Kasserine. II Corps prepared its defenses deliberately, with infantry positioned on commanding ground, artillery emplaced to cover likely avenues of approach, and tank destroyer units held in depth rather than exposed forward. Unlike the earlier battle, positions were mutually supporting, communications rehearsed, and fire plans prepared in advance rather than improvised under pressure. The primary responsibility for the defense fell to elements of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division and attached armored and tank destroyer battalions, supported by a dense artillery grouping whose guns were registered and centrally controlled. Forward observers occupied elevated ground with clear lines of sight into the valley, radios tested repeatedly, and contingency plans established for rapid shifts of fire. The defense was layered, designed to absorb an attack, disrupt it at range, and destroy it before penetration could be exploited. On 23 March 1943, German forces under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim launched a renewed offensive, committing elements of the 10th Panzer Division in an attempt to break through American lines and regain operational momentum. German tanks advanced with confidence born of recent success, expecting once again to find scattered resistance and slow reaction. Instead, their movement triggered immediate artillery concentrations that fell with precision and weight, breaking up formations and forcing tanks to halt or maneuver under fire. As German armor pressed forward, American tank destroyers engaged from concealed positions, firing into flanks while artillery continued to shift and adjust in response to observed movement. Infantry units held their ground, resisting infiltration attempts that might have unhinged the defense, while command posts maintained continuous contact with subordinate elements. The battle unfolded not as a chaotic clash, but as a controlled sequence of engagements, each reinforcing the next. By the end of the day, the German attack had stalled. Approximately 30 German tanks were destroyed or disabled, losses that the Axis could not easily replace, while American casualties, though real, remained limited in comparison. The El-Gettar Valley had held, not through luck or numerical advantage, but through coordination, discipline, and applied doctrine. And as the battlefield fell quiet, it became evident that this engagement marked a decisive contrast to Kasserine, a confirmation that the changes imposed in the preceding weeks had been tested under fire and found effective. The engagement at El-Gettar did not end the Tunisian campaign, nor did it represent a decisive strategic victory on its own. But within the U.S. Army, it carried a weight far greater than its geographic scale suggested. In the span of 27 days, from the collapse at Kasserine to the stabilized front at El-Gettar, an army that had entered combat burdened by illusion and institutional inertia had demonstrated a capacity for rapid, systemic adaptation under fire. This was not a story of sudden brilliance, but of enforced correction, in which failure was analyzed without sentiment and translated into concrete change. For Allied commanders, the significance lay in proof rather than promise. American units had shown they could absorb defeat, restructure command relationships, revise doctrine, and apply lessons immediately against the same enemy formations that had routed them weeks earlier. British observers, initially skeptical of American readiness, reported a marked shift in efficiency, discipline, and coordination, while German commanders noted in their own assessments that American defenses had become harder, more predictable in their reactions, and increasingly costly to probe. The victory at El-Gettar validated a new operational logic. Centralized artillery as the backbone of defense, armored forces used with restraint and purpose, and command exercised forward, close to the point of decision. These principles were not confined to Tunisia, but carried forward into Sicily, Italy, and eventually Northwest Europe, forming the practical foundation of American ground operations for the remainder of the war. Training programs were rewritten, staff procedures standardized, and the expectation of joint cooperation between arms became institutional rather than aspirational. Equally important was the psychological effect within the ranks, as soldiers and junior officers recognized that their survival no longer depended on improvisation alone, but on a system increasingly designed to support them. Confidence replaced uncertainty, not because the enemy had weakened, but because the army itself had become more coherent in how it fought. The German army remained formidable, but its advantages could now be met with method rather than reaction. The transformation completed in those 27 days did not guarantee success in every subsequent battle, but it established a pattern, the ability to learn faster than the opponent, to compress experience into doctrine, and to accept that modern war rewarded adaptability over tradition. El-Gettar was therefore not a triumph in the classical sense, but a confirmation that the U.S. Army had become an institution capable of correcting itself in time, a quality that would prove decisive long after the dust of the Tunisian valleys had settled.